Good morning. It's good to be with you this morning, and it's good for all of us to be together, even if we can't be together in person. As we begin our worship service this morning, let me share words with you from the poet Adrienne Rich. My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. Come, my friends, moved by all we cannot save, casting our lot with others, committed to do what we can. Come, let us worship together.
When I am down and oh my soul so weary, when troubles come and my heart burdened be, then I am still and wait here in the silence until you come and sit a while with me. You raise me up so I can stand on mountains. You raise me up to walk on stormy seas. I am strong when I am on your shoulders. You raise me up to more than I can be. You raise me up raise me up to more than I can be. He raised me up so I can stand on mountains. He raised me up to walk on stormy seas. I am strong when I am on your shoulders. You raise me up to more than I can be. You raise me up so I can stand on mountains. You raise me up to walk on stormy seas. I am strong when I am on your shoulders. You raise me up to more than I can be. You raise me up to more than I can be.
The flaming chalice is the symbol of the Unitarian Universalist tradition, the liberal religious tradition to which this congregation belongs. Will you join me in reciting the words on the screen? If you have a chalice at home, I invite you to light it with me at this time. As we kindle this flame, we recommit ourselves to the mission of this congregation, to build a Unitarian Universalist community that transforms lives and empowers people to serve the world. May the light of this flame be welcoming to all who seek a liberal religious home.
Please follow along on screen for the Beauty of the Earth. For the beauty of the earth, for the splendor of the skies, for the love which from our birth over and around us lies. Source of all, to thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise. For the joy of ear and eye, for the heart and mind's delight, for the mystic harmony, linking sense to sound and sight. Source of all, to thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise. For the wonder of each hour, of the day, of the night, hill and vale and tree and flower, sun and moon and stars of light. Source of all, to thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise. For the joy of human care, sister, brother, parent, child, for the kinship we all share, for all gentle thoughts and mild. Source to all, to thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise.
Whether you are watching from your smartphone, your laptop, or your smart TV, whether you are in Raleigh or halfway around the world, we're glad that you're with us today. Here at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Raleigh, we are intentionally inclusive, liberally religious, and actively serving the common good of Wake County and our larger world. That means that whoever you are and wherever you are on your religious journey, you are welcome here. That also means as Unitarian Universalists, we seek wisdom and inspiration from many sources, but affirm our own individual experiences and conscience as the best authority of our beliefs. That also means that we are committed to making our world more compassionate and just, and hope that you might join in our many efforts to do so. After the service today, please join us for social hour in one of our Zoom rooms. There are instructions on how to access our Zoom room that we'll be using for social hour on our website at uufr.org. If you haven't visited with us before in person and would like to be added to our weekly emails that you can find out about everything we're doing online, even when we're not meeting in person, please visit uufr.org/visitor form. We know that sometimes our weekly email gets lost in the huge volume of email everybody receives. So I'd like to let everybody know that we now have a new box on our website's homepage called Stay Up to Date and Connected, with links to newsletters, blogs, Facebook groups, and our YouTube channel. If you are looking for a way to safely volunteer to help others financially during this public health crisis, there is also information about how to do so there. While we can't meet one another in person this morning, I invite people to say hello and meet and greet using the chat function on your screen. This is the time in our service when we acknowledge some of the joys and the sorrows of our community. This morning, we hold in our heart the loved ones of the tens of thousands of people around the world who have already lost their lives to the coronavirus. We hold in our hearts all of those who are infected and lift up our hopes that they may recover and that fewer will become infected in the coming days. We hold in our hearts all of our healthcare workers. We hold in our hearts all of the other essential workers and all of those who continue to work because they feel like they have no choice. We hold in our hearts all of those who are lonely, and those who are afraid for themselves and for others, about health, about money, and about so many things beyond our complete control. We hold in our heart all of those unable to spend time with loved ones and all those who are spending too much time with loved ones. We hold in our hearts our children and youth who struggle to pass so much time inside, away from school and away from friends. We hold in our hearts all of those who will miss birthday parties, graduations, and long-planned trips. We hold in our hearts all of those whose ordinary, everyday struggles are more complicated by our current situation. We lift up our hopes for compassion, for gratitude for simple joys, for acceptance of necessary adjustments, for calm, for courage, for patience, and for a return to normalcy as soon as it is safe for us to do so. If you have an individual joy or sorrow to share, I invite you to post it now in the chat box on the screen. As we reflect on the joys, sorrows, the fears, and the hopes we all hold in our hearts, let us be together now for a time of stillness and silence, opening ourselves to that within us, between us, and amidst us, called by many names, but known to every human heart. After the silence, we will sing hymn number 391, Voice Still and Small. But for now, let's be together in silence.
Voice still and small, deep inside all, I hear you call, singing. In dark and rain, sorrow and pain, still you remain, singing, calming my fears, quenching my tears through all the years, singing.
Everything that we do at UUFR, whether we are meeting in person or only online, still depends on the generosity of all of you who are members and friends. Since we're not meeting in person, please consider mailing a check to the UUFR office or using our new and easier to use online donation form at www.uufr.org/donation. And please consider doing that now. If you're able, I'd also really like to encourage you to make an extra donation to one of our community partners who are helping some of our most vulnerable neighbors, some of the most vulnerable members of our larger community. You can find information about how to do that in this week's chalice or in a new box on our website, How to Help. It's now time for this morning's offering. Please be generous.
Our reading this morning is titled Liberation is Costly, and it is by Desmond Tutu. Liberation is costly. Even after the Lord had delivered the Israelites from Egypt, they had to travel through the desert. They had to bear the responsibilities and difficulties of freedom. There was starvation and thirst And they kept complaining. They complained that their diet was monotonous. Many of them preferred the days of bondage and the flesh pots of Egypt. We must remember that liberation is costly. It needs unity. We must refuse to be divided. We must be ready. Some of us will not see the day of our liberation physically, but those people will have contributed to the struggle. Let us be united. Let us be filled with hope. Let us be those who respect one another.
I never made this world, I didn't even lose it. And I know no one said it was fair, but they had a garden once, they had the chance to choose it. They gave it away, including my share. And now we're lost in the wilderness, lost crying in the wilderness, with no chance of living, boy, until you confess we're lost in the wilderness. You follow all the rules, you swallow all the stories, and every night you'd wish on a star, dreaming your day would come, trusting in allegories, and every morning, boy, look where you are, lost in the wilderness, lost, slowly dying in the wilderness. And if anyone's watching, it seems they couldn't care less. We're lost in the wilderness. Did you ever watch the eagle fly to the sun and wonder how we got to feel so free? If you ever have, you know your journey's begun. But what have you got to lose, boy, when already we are lost in the wilderness? And where we are headed, boy, I couldn't even guess. But off we go without a warning, running as we hit the ground, where our future lies a warning, where our hearts are outward bound. To that bright and distant morning, we may stop and look around, and there in the wilderness, finally we'll be found.
I figured many of us have been dwelling too much on the news of the corona pandemic this week. So this Sunday, I wanted to focus on something seemingly unrelated, the Jewish holiday of Passover. Passover begins this week, Wednesday, April 8th at sundown, and Jews around the world will celebrate this holiday with seders in their homes. So this year I imagine that many of those seders will be smaller and simpler. Passover is a holiday that celebrates the Exodus story in the Hebrew Bible, the story of how the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, struggled against their oppression, gained liberation, journeyed through the wilderness, and finally reached the promised land that God had promised to them. Now, I'm sure that many of you probably know something about the Exodus story. I'm sure that at least a few of you learned about it in Sunday school growing up. I grew up unchurched, so my early understanding of the story came from watching the Ten Commandments by Cecil B. DeMille on television every year around this time. It's a good story. And as far as biblical stories go, it has more miracles per minute than almost any other. It has sex, violence, frogs, and chariots. What more could you ask for from a Bible story or from any story? But here's the question for us this morning. As Unitarian Universalists who look to many religious traditions for wisdom and inspiration, what inspiration and wisdom does the story hold for us? Historians and modern biblical scholars tell us that something like the Exodus probably did occur. Archaeological evidence shows that a group of people called the Hapiru, which at least sounds like the word Hebrew. The archaeological evidence shows that this group were conquered and enslaved by the Egyptians. And historians also tell us that slave rebellions and escapes of small bands of slaves were also very common. However, it's unlikely that anything on the scale of the events described in Exodus, with or without the miracles, ever occurred. Still, I think it's a great story because, like many of the stories of the Bible that have been passed down from generation to generation, it contains what might be called universal truths about human experience. And even more than that, it's a story that invites us to reflect on our own lives. What do I mean? Well, as we consider how the Hebrews were oppressed by Pharaoh, the story invites us to ask ourselves, what oppresses us in our own lives? It invites us to ask ourselves, what stands between us and the promised land? And by the promised land, I'm not talking about a specific place. The story asks us to consider what stands between us and living a freer, better life. Now, like the Hebrew people who were enslaved by Pharaoh, it might be something external to ourselves. The story invites us to consider whether we're enslaved by a job we don't like, an unhealthy relationship, a house that's become too big for us to take care of by ourselves, or simply a schedule that's too full, or, at least used to be too full. But not all pharaohs are external. So the story also invites us to consider whether we're enslaved by something within ourselves. Unrealistic expectations that we might have of ourselves. Fears or worries about what others might think of us or not think of us. Fears or worries about what may or may not happen in the future. The story invites us to reflect on our lives in other ways as well. When Moses comes to Pharaoh for the first time and demands, "Let my people go," what does Pharaoh do? He ignores him. When Moses comes to Pharaoh the second time and says, "Let my people go," what does Pharaoh do? He ignores him. When Moses comes to Pharaoh the third time and demands, "Let my people go," what does Pharaoh do? Pharaoh ignores him. It's only the 10th time that Moses comes to Pharaoh that Pharaoh listens. This part of the story, it reminds us that whether we are dealing with something external to ourselves or something within ourselves, our efforts to change our lives for the better will rarely succeed on the first try, or the second try, or even the third try. It reminds us that real change often takes place only through persistent effort after many losses and setbacks and disappointments. It reminds us also that those in power rarely relinquish power easily or at the first demand. In the Exodus story, the freed Hebrew slaves don't go directly from Egypt to the Promised Land. They have to wander through the wilderness, and this isn't an easy journey. Early on during the journey, many of them begin to complain and rebel against Moses. It would have been better if we had stayed in Egypt, some of them say. Even though we were slaves, we had water to drink and food to eat. It was better than wandering around here without either. We should turn back, they say. This, too, is one of the most important parts of the story for me. It reminds me that any time that we make a change in our lives or have to deal with a change, we rarely go from something bad to something good. There's always some wandering around in the wilderness. When we leave a job we don't like, we often have to do so without knowing what job we might have next. When we leave a relationship that isn't good for us, we often have to do so without knowing if or when we might be in a relationship again. When we go back to school, we often do so not knowing exactly how things will turn out, if they will. And it also reminds us that any time we make a change, there will be at least some part of us that says, this wasn't a good idea. Let's go back. It really wasn't that bad. Having been a minister for many years, I also know that when any congregation makes a change, no matter how good the change, a few people will also say, we should go back to doing things the way we used to do them. What happens next in the Exodus story? As the recently freed Hebrew slaves are wandering around in the desert without food or water, and at least some of them are considering going back, God sends them manna, our bread from heaven, to help them get by. And they do. Now, when some of us here, when some of you listening hear this, you may think to yourselves, well, this is just another one of those convenient biblical miracles. But I choose to interpret this part of the story in a different way. As a minister, I've often had the opportunity to talk with people when they were going through difficult times, when they were experiencing situations more difficult than any they could have imagined, that any they have had experienced before in life, situations that they wouldn't have thought they'd even be able to survive before they found themselves in the midst of them. And yet somehow they did manage to survive and get through these situations. And here's something that I've sometimes observed, not always, but sometimes. Often when people find themselves in these unimaginable situations, they discover within themselves or are among their circle of friends and loved ones resources that they never knew were there before, that were there all along, but they just didn't know were there. People that they could lean on for help, that they didn't know were there. Inner strengths that they didn't know they had. So rather than seeing the manna from heaven as just another convenient biblical miracle, I see it as a reminder that whenever any of us sets off on a journey of change, or whenever we find ourselves in a very difficult situation, we will likely discover resources along the way that we simply didn't know were there. Now, if this story just stopped there, with the people of Israel being freed from bondage in Egypt, it would be a good story. But it doesn't stop there. At least one more very important thing happens before the people of Israel get to the promised land. Now most of us know what happened. What happened? At Mount Sinai, they received the Ten Commandments. Now why is this an important part of the story? Unfortunately, I think that most of us think of the commandments in the wrong way. The text of the Hebrew Bible itself doesn't even refer to the Ten Commandments. They are not numbered out 1 through 10. In fact, there's a lot more than 10 commandments. There's a total of 613 commandments in the Hebrew Bible. And by the way, I happen to think if religious conservatives want to post the 10 commandments in public or any commandments in public, they should have to post all of them, all 613, preferably in the original Hebrew. The biggest problem with how we traditionally think of the first 10 commandments, as well as all the others, is that we think of them as rules handed down on high. Rules like the kind of rules that some parents would set for their children. You better do this or you're going to get in trouble. Those kind of rules. But the truth is the Ten Commandments and all the other commandments as well aren't really rules at all. What are they? They're part of a covenant, an agreement between God and the Hebrew people, in which God says, you will be my people, and the Hebrew people say, you will be our God. And as part of this covenant, they commit themselves to certain values and ideals, a particular way of life. Too often when we hear the Exodus story and read about the Ten Commandments, I think we tend to focus on the specifics of the commandments and whether they make sense or not. But when we do this, I think we miss the big picture. And the big picture is that in order to reach the promised land, it wasn't enough for the Hebrew people just to get away from Pharaoh. It wasn't enough for them just to be free. They then had to commit themselves to something beyond themselves. And this is the main message that the Exodus story speaks to me. It's not enough to be free. It's not enough to be free from internal or external oppressions that hold us back. Getting free of those will always be a necessary first step, but it won't ever be enough for any of us to reach our own promised lands. To really reach our own promised lands, to live lives as fully, deeply, and richly as we can. It's necessary not only to be free from either external or internal constraints, but it's necessary to have a commitment to something beyond ourselves that will give meaning and direction to our lives. Something that we're willing to put at the top of our long list of priorities above everything else. Otherwise, we will spend the rest of our lives wandering around aimlessly in the desert. I've spent a lot of time in the past talking with people who were in various stages of recovery. And many of them have told me that it wasn't enough to be free of alcohol or drugs, for example. They also had to find something else to which they could commit their lives, which would give their lives purpose and meaning. To sum up, more than a story of the miraculous, the Exodus story is a powerful story for reflection. It's a story for reflection that challenges us to look at our own lives in a new way. It asks, what oppresses you in your own life? What's holding you back? What, if anything, stands between you and the promised land? What, if anything, stands between you and a freer, better life? It asks, in your efforts to that better life, have you given up after one try? Or have you tried a second time, or a third time, or even a 10th time? It asks, if you're journeying through the wilderness, are you being tempted to turn back? It asks, what are the yet unrecognized resources in your own life that might help you in your journey through the wilderness? It asks, What's most important to you? What are you willing to commit to and make sacrifices for in order to reach the promised land? I said at the beginning of my words that the celebration of Passover and the larger Exodus story are seemingly unrelated to our current situation. But in truth, I don't think they're unrelated at all. In asking who or what our Pharaoh is now, the easy answer would be the coronavirus. But I want to suggest that we all might dig a little bit deeper. As we each deal with our own current circumstances, what stands between you and a freer, better life today? Is it fear? Is it loneliness? Is it boredom? What is standing between us as a nation and our ability to respond effectively to the coronavirus? Is it selfishness, greed, and short-sightedness? Or simply our overly individualistic attitude? Is it the anti-scientific, anti-institutional attitude too common among too many Americans? Just as Moses confronted Pharaoh 10 times, the Exodus story reminds us that either in our efforts to make adjustments in our own lives and our own homes to a new way of life, or our efforts to defeat the coronavirus, we are unlikely to be successful on our first attempts. The Exodus story also reminds us that there are likely to be people among us who complain loudly, saying, turn back, let's go back to the way things were by Easter. The Exodus story reminds us too that we likely have undiscovered resources within us and among us and around us, like manna from heaven that will sustain us through difficult times. The Exodus story reminds us that it will not be enough for us to one day be free of the coronavirus. It reminds us that we must ask ourselves, after this is all over, or even before this is all over, what new commitments are we willing to make? What new promises are we willing to make to ourselves as individuals? What new promises do we want to make as a nation, as a society? Are we finally willing to acknowledge how interconnected we all are? And are we finally willing to make a commitment to start treating one another as members of the same human family? And my friends, the Exodus story reminds us that we're probably going to have to wander in the wilderness for some time to come. Hopefully it won't be 40 years. But I think it's going to be, at the very least, another 40 days and nights. Let's remember too, though, that there can be beauty and goodness and joy as we wander in the wilderness together. My friends, I truly miss seeing so many of you in person on Sunday mornings. And I hope that all of you are doing your best to take care of yourselves and to take care of all of those whom you love. I lift up my hope this morning that all of us together will reach the promised land together one day, very soon. So may it be. Amen.
Please join me in Our World is One World. Our world is a one world. What touches one affects us all. The the seas that wash us round about, the clouds that cover us, the rains that fall. Our world is a one world. The thoughts we think affect us all. The way we build our attitudes with love or hate, we make a bridge or wall. Our world is a one world. Its ways of wealth affect us all. The way we spend, the way we share, who are the rich or poor, who stand or fall. Our world is a one world, just like a ship that bears us all, where fear and greed make many holes, but where our hearts can hear a different call.
As this time of worship ends, may we return to our own lives with ever more compassion for one another, with ever more gratitude for this precious gift of life we share this very day, with ever more peace in our hearts, and with ever more hope for our own lives in this world we share. Amen.